Welcome to the Marvel Podcast for Gifted Listeners, your podcast all about Marvel's history, its characters, and everything in between. In our first episode, I'll go over a general history timeline of Marvel Comics, starting from the time they were Timely Comics up until 1960. The next three episodes will continue this timeline until we reach 2024, when these episodes were written and recorded. This will be a general timeline, and future episodes are going to delve deeper into different aspects of Marvel's history, characters, and everything in between. Marvel Comics has had a long and storied history, from a small comic company to war propaganda, almost going bankrupt, and now they have one of the largest movie franchises ever created. Now, let's turn back the clock and go back to 1939 and begin our timeline. Back in 1938, Action Comics number 1 debuted, introducing the world to Superman. Even though comics had been around for just under a decade, nothing like Superman had ever graced their pages. After there was a few copycats of the Big Blue Boy Scout who had been dealt with legal action and subsequently dismissed, a man named Martin Goodman, who had been a pulp fiction publisher, was convinced by Frank Torpey, a sales manager for Funnies Inc., an early comic company, to add comics to his pulp fiction books. In 1939, Marvel Comics number 1 was produced. Not all the comics were super in this first issue, though. In fact, most of the stories were overlooked in these books until readers reached the story of the Human Torch, an android who would burst into flames when exposed to oxygen, not a member of the Fantastic Four that we know today, and Namor the Submariner. Both of these characters would make appearances in the MCU. The Human Torch was featured in Captain America, the First Avenger, as an Easter egg at the Stark Expo, and the Submariner would appear as the antagonist in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. The first publishing of Marvel Comics number 1 printed 80,000 copies. These 80,000 issues sold out almost immediately. A second run of this book was printed, and even more copies sold just as well. This was the birth of Timely Comics. Goodman printed issue number 2, renaming the comic to Marvel Mysteries, adding mystery to the name to lure in pulp fiction fans to the world of comics. Marvel Mystery Comics would rotate covers between Namor, the Angel, and the Human Torch. The Angel was a vigilante that was inspired by the Two-Gun Kid, a Western hero who told the Angel that the age of heroes was coming, and the Angel would be one of those heroes. Goodman added 2 more titles to his little publishing company, but these titles weren't as successful as Marvel Mystery. But Goodman still felt that he needed in-house help. To continue his growing company, Goodman hired on Joe Simon, and Joe Simon brought with him the now famous Jack Kirby. Even though 2 follow-up titles didn't strike gold like Marvel Mystery, Goodman was determined. He would eventually dedicate solo titles to the Human Torch and the Submariner respectively. Soon, a third hero would hit the pages, taking the comic world by storm. Captain America, the First Avenger. Now a household name, he was popular during the war. He wasn't the name he is today. We'll see that later in the timeline. For now, he was a wartime hero, comic and real world needed. Captain America would fight the Axis powers along with his kid sidekick, Bucky. The Captain became the best-selling title for Timely. Also, you may ask, why was the Captain bringing a child into the ravages of war? Well, simply, they needed someone for Captain America to talk to on his adventures, and they just didn't want him talking to himself. So, that's why Bucky was there. During all his success, though, not all was dandy in-house at Timely. After making the first 10 issues of Captain America, Goodman would have disputes with Jack Kirby and Joe Simon about profit sharing. This led Simon and Kirby to pack their pens and head to DC Comics. Kirby would eventually return to Marvel, which we'll see in the next episode. But Simon never truly returned. With the departure of Kirby and Simon, Goodman needed a new editor-in-chief. Instead of searching for an external person, he looked to his young nephew, Stanley Liebert, who was only 18 at the time. This young editor, who is now better known as Stan Lee, would use the pen name as Stan Lee because he wanted to save his real name for when he was writing quote-unquote actual books. Stan was supposed to be a temporary editor until Goodman found a permanent editor-in-chief. Well, 30 years later, Lee had never been permanently replaced. However, during the war years, Lee had been drafted in 1942, and Vince Fargo would serve as an interim editor-in-chief while Stan was overseas fighting the good fight. Lee would script stories for Timely, as well as write train films for the Army. But before Lee had been shipped off while he was still editor-in-chief, a team of heroes was created to fight the Axis powers, along with the big three of Cap, Namor, and the Torch. There was the Destroyer, the Patriot, the Whizzer, the Vision, not the Vision we know today, and Miss America. These characters never really held the same popularity as the big three, but they still helped fill out the Age of Wartime heroes. When World War II ended, the general public and servicemen who had loved the wartime comics were just no longer interested in reading stories about our wartime heroes. Because, how could small-time gangsters in New York stand up to the evil that was the Axis powers? So, beginning in 1942, funny animal comics were what was now in the public's eye, and Timely had to keep up with the times. They bought the rights to Mighty Mouse and other Paul Terry animated characters to feature in their books. And, while Stan Lee was overseas, coincidentally, his interim replacement was familiar with the funny animal genre. Even though Marvel had established a few original funny animal creations, none lasted once the war was truly over. With heroes and animals not holding the public's interest anymore, Timely had to keep up with what was popular in the comic world, and they returned to yet another genre that was making a scene in the comics: teen romance. There were comics like Archie, which had been going on since 1942, but those focused on the life and love of a teenage boy. Timely was looking to bring a different audience, the teenage girl. Timely would write their own series, being led by a teenage girl, Patsy Walker, who would later go on to become the superheroine Hellcat. And with this new character, they would bring in the teenage girl audience. And yeah, at the 40s, Timely turned to yet another genre, the Wild West. This was to continue the trend of following the trend of what was popular in comics. The Wild West comics became headliners, and the heroes of the war were left behind. In 1949, Captain America, the Human Torch, and the Submariner were all canceled, ending the superheroes of Timely. It also marked the end of an era. Most of the staff had been laid off, only keeping Stan Lee on as a full-time staff member. And a new company names were being tried out since Timely Comics never truly caught on. As the 50s began, Timely tried a new hero, Marvel Boy. Instead of headlining his own title like the Human Torch or the Submariner or the Captain, the magazine would eventually transform into Astonishing. Marvel Boy's adventures only lasted a few issues into the book becoming Astonishing. Timely added another genre to its ever-growing list. The young company now delved into horror. For the next 3 years, Goodman did what he does best: publish, publish, publish. Goodman would publish books that had a large main story taking up most of the cover, and then in the bottom of the page there would be 3 other. Now the young company delved into horror. For the next 3 years, Goodman did what he does best: publish, publish, publish. Goodman would publish books that had a large main story taking up most of the cover, and then they would show 3 smaller stories on the bottom of the cover. So hopefully kids would see these and think they were getting a bargain for their dime. In 1951, the Korean War broke out, and Timely was back to their wartime comics. The Korean War comics didn't take any sides and just told stories about what the war was like. But as the war went on, Timely did publish 3 series that showed a more fictional side of the war, and these comics were deemed unpatriotic. Only one of the 3 titles would survive after the truce of the war. While writing these war comics, behind the scenes, Goodman had parted ways with his old publishing company, Funnies Incorporated, and started his own publishing company, Atlas. Even though the common man referred to Timely as Atlas, for the time being, in-house, everyone still referred to it as Timely. Following the cancellation of the Korean War comics, the big 3 of World War II came back into publication. Captain America, The Torch, and Namor were all back, with varying explanations of how they were all back, and they were right back to fighting the good fight. This time, the big 3 were fighting the Communists and the Red Scare. But, as history does, it repeated itself, and the big 3 saw cancellation once again. Except for the Submariner. Why was Namor saved from the cutting room floor? Well, that's because there was a live-action television show in production. The Submariner was about to be the first Timely hero to make it to the small screen. Unfortunately, negotiations fell apart, and Namor was now gone as well, thus truly ending the second coming of these heroes. If losing their big 3 heroes wasn't enough, the comic world and Timely faced a new but familiar threat: moral panic. In 1954, Dr. Frederick Wertham was working with disturbed and juvenile youth. He noticed that they all read comics, so he published a book called Seduction of Innocence. In this book, he would state that the influence of comic books on today's youth that depicted crime and horror were what made them bad. And so he suggested that simply if comics didn't feature these bad themes, then kids wouldn't be as influenced and they wouldn't be as bad or juvenile as they were. You know how, wouldn't be as bad if they weren't influenced by the comics, just like how people believe violent video games cause violent kids. All the outrage that came from this book caused comic publishers to form the Comic Magazine Association of America. The administrative branch of this new association was known as the Comics Code Authority, which began to censor comic books to make sure they were suitable for the youngest of readers. The seal was only given to comics that had been approved by the Comic Codes Authority, as long as they no longer had the word horror or terror on the cover. They did not depict werewolves, vampires, or the Walking Dead. Police, parents, and other authority figures had to be treated with respect, and drugs could not be depicted as a main storytelling element. But Timely was able to survive the initial storm by switching their horror titles to mystery titles and shifting to comics focused on the Black Knight, a medieval hero, if you will. Unfortunately, the Black Knight comics only lasted 5 issues. In 1956 and 57, Steve Ditko joined the Timely team, and Jack Kirby made his return. Kirby took over art for a comic called Yellow Claw, which featured a Pulp Fiction villain, Fu Manchu, a now outdated stereotypical villain. But this comic would only last for 4 issues because people just simply weren't interested in reading a comic where a villain was the main character, which now is kind of funny looking back. In 1957, Goodman decided to close down Atlas and have Timely books distributed by the American News Company. Unfortunately, just a few months after Goodman had made the transition, American News Company shut down. This means that Timely books could no longer get to newsstands, so that means they couldn't really sell anything. So, in a tight spot, Goodman had to make a disadvantageous deal with National/DC Comics, which owned a distribution company called Independent News. This deal allowed Timely to still distribute books, but only 8 a month. Instead of going for 8 a month, Goodman opted to distribute 16 bi-monthly issues so that Timely would have a greater presence in American newsstands. Stan Lee was still the only staff member on board, and everyone else was freelance. Because he didn't have full-time artists on staff, Stan Lee was using backup art that they had to create new stories. But by the end of 1957 and the beginning of 1958, all those backup drawings were starting to run dry, which this allowed Stan Lee to begin writing titles such as Strange Worlds, Tales to Astonish, and Tales of Suspense. These books would eventually go on to introduce the world to now household names like Iron Man and Ant-Man. After a year, Goodman managed to up his monthly book amount from 8 to 10, but he would continue with the bi-monthly motto so that there is now 20 bi-monthly books hitting the newsstand shelves instead of just the 16. Now that Timely has small leg to stand on, they began to delve into yet another genre, monsters. With the likes of King Kong and Godzilla gracing the big screens, Timely was able to jump on the new trend and begin to publish book after book of monsters, which these comics would usually be resolved by the monster being defeated by the humans that were using some sort of scheme. Sometimes the amount of work was just too much for Stan Lee, so he eventually gave some work to his little brother, Larry Lieber, and he would give him a skeleton script to finish off. Sales on these new books kept Timely afloat, but soon everything would change in 1961. We will see what took place in 1961 next time. Now let's get out of this timeline and go over the top 5 things that we learned today in the pre-Marvel era of Marvel Comics. Number 1. Marvel Comics was originally called Timely Comics. The original big 3 of Marvel were Captain America, the Android the Human Torch, and Namor the Submariner. Before 1961, Timely mainly featured everything but superheroes. Yes, we had the big 3 and some heroes here and there, but for the most part, Timely Comics was a wide range of genres and stories, from horror to wartime stories to funny animals. Number 4. Jack Kirby started his career in the comics world at Timely, and he soon left for DC, and then he would eventually return to Timely/Marvel. Number 5. Stan Lee was the nephew of the creator of Timely Comics, Martin Goodman, and would be the editor-in-chief for 30 years. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the Marvel timeline. Next time, we will start to explore the time of heroes in Timely and its evolution into Marvel Comics, starting with the Fantastic Four. We'll cover the timeline of Timely/Marvel from 1961 till about the mid-70s. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by myself, James Bazinski. Intro music sourced from freesound.org. Until next time, gifted listeners, thank you for listening, and Excelsior!